Here to give us a bit of a high-level view of the 2012 legislative session and the messages heading into the campaign season, we have Dr. Kathryn Pearson from the University of Minnesota. Doctor, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Let's begin with that particular question and give me your impression of the legislative session and what you think the key message or messages are leading into this campaign season.
Well, legislators and voters alike will be talking about the stadium. The stadium received the most press. It was at the end of the session. Voters on both sides of the issue were wondering what's going to happen. And of course, it dominated the press coverage and the messaging coverage as well. It was one of the governor's highest priorities. And then, of course, the legislature, for its part, promised to get it through, but it became very complicated because, of course, some Republicans were strong proponents, but many in the Republican leadership actually were not in favor of the Viking stadium. But they really fulfilled a promise to actually just procedurally move forward on it, even with opposition. So,
and given the fact that it was not a caucus position, how do they take that stadium and take that into the campaign season individually? And say, for example, Speaker Zellers, we had him on a bit earlier in the show. How does he incorporate that into his message, given that he didn't support the bill?
Right. Well, it's complicated for him because at one level, all politics is local. So, of course, his constituents, like all legislators' constituents, will want to know, what was my legislator's vote and what was the rationale. But the leadership also has the responsibility of keeping the trains running on time, so to speak, fulfilling promises. And so the Republican leadership didn't want to be seen as blocking a proposal that did have a lot of support, but at the same time, individual leaders are accountable to their constituents to be reelected. But they do have to wear both hats, and so voters may find that complicated. But where it will matter most, of course, is in the most competitive districts. So even though people are passionate on both sides, many incumbent legislators don't face strong challengers. So even if they find themselves at odds with some of their voters on their position, without a quality challenger running against them in a competitive race, it won't matter. But where it will matter is, of course, in these competitive districts where legislators took a position that could be at odds with their constituents.
Let's talk about the two constitutional amendments that'll be ballot initiatives. One defining marriage, excuse me, as a union between one man and one woman. The other requires voter photo ID at the polls. Now let's talk first about for lack of a better phrase, we're going to just say that the ban on same-sex marriage. There's speculation that Minnesota could be the first state to defeat this. What do you think?
Well, this is an issue where public opinion is changing most rapidly. So political scientists typically see a lot of stability in public opinion on most issues, but gay rights, gay marriage is one notable exception. So here, public opinion is moving quite quickly, especially among young voters. And so I think the question is, will young voters show up at the polls? Now, presidential elections always garner high turnout. Minnesota is often the highest in the nation. It certainly was 4 years ago. So we expect that turnout will be high. But I think the question is, will disaffected voters on both sides of the aisle, both liberals and conservatives, who perhaps aren't overly enthusiastic about their party's nominee, will they turn out and vote for or against the amendment?
Do amendments tend to drive people, though, to the polls where even if somebody is a bit disenfranchised?
The most important driver is, of course, a presidential contest. And so we already have that going on. But at the margins, this could matter. And again, especially among the most liberal voters and the most conservative voters who perhaps might think that their presidential nominees are too moderate.
So no projections on whether or not Minnesota will defeat the measure?
This is going to be extremely close either way. The polls right now suggest that it will be defeated, and opponents do have one advantage, and that is, of course, that if someone simply doesn't vote on the constitutional amendment, that essentially still matters for the denominator, so counts as a no vote.
Okay, let's talk about voter photo ID. It's heading to the courts right now. Do you think if it makes it on the ballot, it has a chance of passing as well?
This does have a chance of passing. Polls have overwhelmingly shown that voters do support voter ID because sort of at the most basic level, it sounds like a pretty simple issue. But once the messages start going out that there's really a lot more to voter ID and who it would disenfranchise, that could change. So I think this one really depends on the messaging and to what extent the opponents of voter ID are able to get some of the complexities out there. But if it were voted on today, it certainly would pass.
Do you think the ballot initiatives are going to hurt or help the GOP at the polls, considering they want to obviously maintain the majority?
Yes. So I think it will do both. So I think it really depends on the district. I think in some very conservative districts it will mobilize voters. The same is true in liberal districts. But I think at the margins in these very competitive districts, that's where it will make the difference. And I suspect that's where supporters and opponents of these amendments will spend the most time, because those swing districts will make or break these amendments, and at the same time they will affect the candidates running in these competitive districts.
And caucus leaders will of course argue that job creation was a priority for every caucus, and each argues that it helped create jobs in different manners. Who do you think wins this message?
Well, they'll each argue that they help create jobs, but then they'll also be launching bombs at the other side. You know, Republicans, for their part, will talk about all of the bills that Governor Dayton vetoed, over 50. And on the other hand, the DFL will talk about the importance of stopping Republican proposals that would have hurt teachers, labor unions, etc. So I think both sides will be armed with talking points, and this will be the defining issue of the campaign. So I think it really depends on which side is better able to convince voters that they've done a good job handling the economy so far and that they'll do better in the future.
Finally, Dr. Pearson, we saw what happened in Wisconsin with the failed attempt to recall Governor Scott Walker. So in your opinion, is this a reflection of the appetite of voters in the Midwest?
Well, the critical issue with the voter recall of Governor Scott Walker is that, of course, voters were not only voting for or against Scott Walker and his policies, which were well known to voters. I mean, it was a very polarized debate. They were also voting on whether or not they thought it was appropriate to have a recall. So if you look at the exit polls, a combined 70% of voters either thought recall elections were never appropriate or only appropriate in really extreme cases. And here was an issue of a recall where there were clear policy divides, but it wasn't so clear that there was corruption or fraud or some of the other elements that most voters thought were appropriate for a recall election. So does it illustrate the diminishing power of labor unions in general? Yes, but we've seen that for many years in this country. But does it suggest a sea change in politics for Wisconsin or the Midwest? I don't think so, because even in the same exit polls, those voters who voted to recall the governor, or excuse me, voted against recalling the governor, were by a 7% margin also supportive of re-electing President Obama. So that 7% margin is only half what his 2008 margin was, but it still suggests that each race has the potential to be different, and there's no one race that's a bellwether for national politics.
And finally, I lied because I do have one last question, but it seems to be a very intriguing race from a national level all the way down to a statewide level, and for local offices as well as for a political analyst. What do you think of this?
Oh, absolutely, because both at the federal level and of course here in Minnesota, we're seeing the consequences of divided government, which is to say both sides have an agenda, and that agenda is thwarted because neither side has control of the executive branch and the legislature. And in an era of polarized politics, which is what we're seeing, that means that not a lot gets done. You could easily have a scenario where divided government means a lot of compromise and bipartisan legislation, but that's not what we're seeing. It's not what we've seen in Minnesota, and it's not what we've seen at the national level. So despite the fact that the electorate is closely divided, the policy positions of the two sides are quite distinct. So it really will be an interesting battle.
Okay, Dr. Kathryn Pearson, thanks for your words. We appreciate them.
My pleasure. Thank you.